Greek view of life. The legacy or heritage of Greece is a phrase which has been much repeated in recent years, since the traditional supremacy of the classics has been questioned, very considerably reduced in the educational system of the large English schools. Alarmed by the sudden cracks and threatened collapse of their classic temple, English and American scholars have been at pains to make the extent of value of the legacy of Greece and Rome clear to the general public, and at times, by the excess of their fervour, protests have, perhaps, rather increased than diminished the distrust of those whom they would reassure or convert. Their theme has been, in general, the literary, artistic, and philosophical achievements of the Greeks, evident in the still existing remains, and to a less extent the development of their political thought and practice, and their championship of liberty. These works constitute the actual legacy of Greece. They are, in one sense, the positive results of the great civilization of Greece, and their appreciation is either aesthetic or educational, under which terms is understood the study of their language and thought, rather than of their art. That, of course, cannot be entirely excluded to train the mind in the habit of clear and precise thought. We may be delighted by the direct contemplation of her architecture or sculpture, or by the artistic form of her literature, whether prose or poetry, or we may be benefit to our minds, and this is her educational legacy in a secondary sense, by following out the recorded attempts of the Greeks to solve the various problems that arise in the course of man's social and political development, problems presented to them in a simple and fundamental form, which they viewed without any bias or tradition from earlier or alien civilizations to complicate the method of approach. Yet there is another legacy, which Greece has left us, more difficult to formulate, for it is negative rather than positive in result, and has no place in the general estimates of their bequest to the modern world, nor is it direct presented in any of the concrete remains of that civilization, though each fragment of literary and artistic and historical record presupposes it and assists its elucidation. It is their conception of the world and of the purpose of life in it, or more precisely, the relationship of the individual to his world. It is the failure of their conception, showing the untenability of one of the two possible attitudes towards experience, which constitutes the great spiritual legacy of Greece to the modern world, in distinction from the more visible heritage of art and of literature. And when we talk of the legacy of Greece, we mean very largely the legacy of Athens, for it is at Athens that in the 5th century BC that a Greek civilization culminates and fails, and it is from the political and social life of that age that spring, as from central fire, those forces of art and literature which are still active in the modern world. It is at Athens that we find the most complete and essential form of Greek civilization, the full development of the Greek conception of the individual's relationship to the world, and it is from Athens that we draw to its full extent the legacy bequeathed to us in her failure. In his recent book on Romanticism, Mr. Lascelles Abercrombie has analysed, in an interesting and illuminating manner, some aspects of the romantic element in literature. He has taken as the touchstone of the romantic spirit a passage from Thomas Campbell's Pleasures of Hope. Quote, "White yon mountain turns the musing eye, whose sun-bright summit mingles with the sky. Why do those cliffs of shadowy tint appear more sweet than all the landscape smiling near? 'Tis distant lends enchantment to the view, and robes the mountain in its azure hue." And from that particular famous line, "'Tis the distance lends enchantment to the view," as having given with epigrammatic force the essence of the romantic temperament, which he finally defines in prose as having been of the habit of mind, that in all respects life in this world is likely to be the most satisfactory when the mind withdraws from outer things and turns in upon itself. Now, if we apply this definition of romanticism to the great period of art and literature in the 5th century Athens, we find that the element of romance is almost entirely wanting. Critics and professors of Greek literature have been at pains to detect the slightest traces of such a spirit, and though they have discovered a few expressions and thoughts, survival perhaps from the thought of the previous century, which may lend themselves to such an interpretation in the main the artistic expression of that great century is singularly free from anything of the kind. Yet in subsequent centuries, and elsewhere in 5th century, if Mr. Abercrombie's interpretation of Pericles is tenable, the vein of Romanticism is much more clear and rich, so that we are not justified in saying that it was incompatible with the Greek genius, but rather that the Greek character in its fullness and most individual manifestation, i.e. Athens, found no place for the romantic attitude of mind in the development of its experience. And if we accept Mr. Abercrombie's conception of Romanticism, which, just as it does not dwell upon the infinite nature of the external world, is peculiarly appropriate to be applied to the Greek experience of the 5th century, it is not difficult to see why the Greeks of that age gave so little sign of such a feeling in their artistic and literary remains. They were entirely absorbed in the act of living and organizing their world. Distinctions between the adequacy and inadequacy of outer and inner things had not yet been made. Life, here and now, was the great adventure, in which they all naturally embarked, the unconscious and harmonious unity of inner and outer experience. There was no distinction between the enchanting or compelling power of what was near or distant. The distant charmed them with the hope of bringing it near to their daily lives, and that consciousness, until the first years of the Peloponnesian War had elapsed, was free from any sense of inevitable disillusionment and failure attaching to the facts of experience. No, neither the records of their own past nor the rise and fall of other nations, if they had been willing to place those nations on a level with themselves, are clearly defined enough to make them feel doubtful about the issue of their own collective achievement. The remark of the Egyptian priest to Solon, recorded in Plato's Timaeus, that the Greeks always remained children, is well known, and harmonizes admirably with their fortunate integrity of outlook. They had the confidence in the future which children have for the full course of experience. It had not yet been completed for them. They realized with supreme clearness the laws and sorrowful necessities of the individual life, and no literature has presented the facts of life, its possibilities, and its realities in clearer and more impressive form than Pindar, Herodotus, and Sophocles. But how much men might do collectively, organized in city-states and federations, and developing in the service of the state all the gifts of mind and body, this was unknown to them, and this was the great adventure of the 5th century. Before that century closed, they had begun to learn in bitterness and blood that this world is likely to be the most satisfactory when the mind draws from outer things and turns in upon itself, as we have quoted earlier. In the literature of the close of the 5th century, and still more in the 4th and following centuries, we can trace more and more easily the beginnings of the gospel of Romanticism, that things are not what they seem, leading up to the refuge from a finite reality afforded by the vision of the distant mountain and the blue flower and the kingdom in the heavens. The fortunate integrity of Greek outlook during the greater part of the 5th century rested upon their sense of the past. How their past appeared to the Greeks may be gathered from the opening pages of Thucydides' history, which were written after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. The facts and probabilities of the past, which the historian thinks worthy of admission or discussion, are few, and he is quite convinced that none of the traditional legends justify presumption that some great or extensive power existed in early times. He treats Agamemnon as a real person, but reduces the estimate of his importance and of the heroic age in general so as to show a steady development from the insignificance of primitive settlements to the mature power of Greece in the Periclean age. But the important moment for the Greeks themselves in their sense of the past is that they had no consciousness of social or political or artistic ideas inherited from other people or earlier civilizations. It may be now established that Asia Minor and Egypt exercised considerable influence on Greek artistic development. But if such surmises occurred to writers or thinkers in the 5th century, they did not win serious consideration. To themselves, they stood firmly on their own feet. The world was what they had made it, and what it would be depended equally on themselves. They were a chosen people, sharply conscious of the distinction between themselves and the barbarians, whose history contained no lessons for them. There had been, to the best of their knowledge, no cycles in their history, leaving a tradition of rise and fall, of advance and failure, to make them suspicious or nervous about the future. So when the crisis of the Persian danger had been successfully passed in 480 BC, and the Greek world had been made secure for themselves by the vigor of their own minds and bodies, their will to live and to act could realize itself under the conditions of mental and physical freedom, such as have fallen to the lot of no other people. The attitude of the Greeks after the Persian wars towards the experience does not show any breaks with earlier tradition. The general estimate of life in the 6th century BC is known from the poems of Solon and Theognis, and differs but little from the views of the great writers of the Periclean age. Such change as there is lies in the abandonment of any attempt to use theological suppositions to interpret experience. Aeschylus really belongs to the earlier epoch, while Pindar, who lived from the 6th far into the 5th century, is in harmony of outlook with Sophocles, the artist par excellence of the greatness of Athens. Their outlook on the world might be summarized as follows. God is immortal and omnipotent, but the belief that he is in heaven does not imply for the Greeks that all was therefore well with the world. As Solon says, man must endure the gifts of the gods, meaning that good and evil alike proceed from their hands. Man's life consists in action, but in the end action is veiled in obscurity. Nor is it any use expecting a sign to, quote, stirring of God's finger to denote he wills that right should have supremacy on earth, not wrong. The gods are in heaven and man is on earth, and must make the best he can of the things on earth. Courage and endurance are necessary in order to bear the sudden changes which fate, i.e. the course of the world, brings about. Suffering, poverty, richness, happiness, joy, sorrow befall man, according to no calculable or relieved scheme of things. Limits are established everywhere within which man must steer his ship. Seek not the life of an immortal, but the achievement of what is within thy power. Short is the time in which the delight of man waxes, and in the same way it falls to the ground, shaken by adverse doom. The first of prizes is good fortune, to be comfortable. The second to be well spoken of. If a man find and possess these things, he has won the highest crown. This clear realization of the facts of life and direct acceptance of it without the assurance of any other help than what man can find in himself implies the sound vitality and strength of will. It may easily sink into the listless of the indifferenceness to life. But even the pessimism, when physical vigor begins to fail, can show itself. Of such weakness there is no trace in the Greeks of the Great Period. On the other hand, it is hard to overestimate the tonic effect on the Greeks, and on the Athenians in particular, of their triumph over the Persians. The will to live and act, to face the facts of life with level and fearless eyes, must have been immensely strengthened by the repulse of the forces of tyranny, and the value of life itself increased by sudden disclosure to man, sound in mind and body, of a wide and fruitful field of action. The repulse of Persia did not produce any great religious revival or new conception of the ordering of the world. The gods received thanksgiving offerings for the victory, but the honour remained with men, and that victory was not taken as a sign that henceforth the gods would interpose to make clear or smooth for man the path of life. Heaven and earth did not draw closer together, and as before man remained dependent on himself in the struggle for existence, but he had one more confidence in the issue of action, more hope of achieving within his narrow limits security of existence, and of realizing more frequently the possible good things that life can offer. External and things and actions and themselves constitute his world, all the reality that concerns him, and out of that reality he has to shape his life. His constant effort, therefore, is towards a form of life which he is sufficient to achieve, and which may be sufficient for himself as he knows himself to be. His hopes and fears are centered in this world and this life. It is an attractive suggestion, and on the one that has been revived in the most recent history of the Greeks, that the funeral oration spoken by Pericles in the second book of Thucydides was never delivered even in substance over the dead of any particular year in the war, but is rather a panegyric upon the spirit of Athens, and the exposition of her way of life written by the historian when he knew that the tale of her days was accomplished, and appropriately inserted in his history before the slow demoralization set in with the plague and the long years of war. Twice in the course of that speech occurs the Greek word which is translated literally by self-sufficient. Speaking of Athens, Pericles observes, "We of the present generation have made our city in all aspects and most self-sufficient to meet the demands of peace or war." And a little later, the individual citizen he speaks of, "I think that each one of us is sufficient in himself to meet the most varied circumstances of life readily and gracefully." Now, self-sufficiency in this double application is the ideal of Athens in the Periclean age. It is the idea of a society founded in the reality of here and now, where the state has achieved some sort of security for the individual, and the individual in his turn pledges himself quite naturally to live and die to uphold that state. There is division of reality in this position, no contrast of the state with any more desirable or durable kingdom set up in the heavens, and no division between the mortal life and body of the individual and his immortal soul. His pleasures and amusements, no less than his life and his daily bread, are most vividly felt to depend upon the self-sufficiency of his city. Separated from the fabric of the city, the individual wanders off into the indefinite extension of the natural world, and feels himself to be without form and void. This belief that life in Athens could satisfy the individual rested upon one great assumption that in both the larger sphere of political action and in the lesser one of private affairs, more must not be expected of life than a fairly equal distribution of success and failure, of good and bad things, while very often the bad will preponderate. In the brief passage of consolation towards the end of the funeral oration, Pericles states, "You know amid what changes and chances you have lived, that they may be called fortunate, to whose lot has fallen an honourable grief like your grief, or an honourable death like their death, and in whose life prosperity and adversity have been equally balanced." And the weakness of man, the burden of his sorrows and labours, is a recurrent theme in Greek literature, from the earliest times rising at moments into the cry that they were far better not to be born at all. Year by year, at the performances of the great Dionysia, the Athenians were confronted with the tragic aspect of life, and Pericles is only reminding them once more of the facts which perhaps years of peace and prosperity had made them forget. During the 50 years since the defeat of Persia, war and peace, victories and defeats, had followed each other in swift succession, and even the great disaster in Egypt had not materially hindered the general activity of Athens, though her power on the mainland was severely restricted by the peace made by the Greek states in 445 BC. The size and efficiency of her navy and the resources of her treasury remained as the tokens of past success and the pledge of future hopes. The course of the world had not been too hard for them. A preponderance of good things had fallen to them, more than could be legitimately expected by men trained in the austere laws of life, which Greek tradition affirmed. That God-given splendor which alone, according to Pindar, makes life delightful fell upon Athens not infrequently during those years, and may well have made that generation accept the experience of here and now, something ultimately real, ultimately good, whose values their artists expressed in the great works on the Acropolis. Even to those who are familiar with the artistic and historical development of Athens, there is always an element of surprise that the actual creation of the Parthenon and its sculpture belongs to the period 447 BC, when a generation which had not fought either at Marathon or Salamis had grown up. That art gave visible form to the highest conceptions of the generations who had achieved with the devotion and service the greatness of Athens, when the last moment came for them to rebuild the temples of their gods. And so was the Parthenon. Their problem was to honor and delight the patron goddess of their city with a house and statue worthy of her. And in the Parthenon, and the sculpture belonging to it, they solved the problem without the use of any unknown quantity so simply and so completely as to admit of no further improvements or refinements. For the significance of the 5th century in Athens lies in this, that for a brief period there actually existed a form of social and political life, an organized city-state, if you would, in which all aspects of mind and body were developed and satisfied, erected simply upon the basis of the recognized limits of facts of life. There was no deliberate shutting of the eye to the other possibilities, the experiences in the past, no concealed belief that the task was on and which they were engaged would never be accomplished on earth. No, the record of the past and their own untarnished vitality urged them forward, not in conscious pursuit of an ideal, but to the exploitation of life within the limits assigned to mortality. No vision of different or spiritual modes of life dimmed or distorted their view of the actual or reduced the expansive force of their practical energies. Concrete existence here and now was their ultimate reality, and immortality, or rather changelessness, of physical life for each god at an appropriate age was the single but insuperable distinction between gods and men. And in the timelessness of artistic existence, this distinction also vanishes. And before the sculptures of the Parthenon, the Athenians could have repeated in perfect truth the words of Pindar, quote, "One race is there of man and gods, and from one mother we both draw our breath. Yet our strength is altogether different, for men are as nothing but the brazen heaven abides forever. A sure habitation. Yet we have some likeness in the form or mighty mind of the immortals, although we do not know what course fate has drawn for us, followed by day or in the night." End quote. For as according to the Jewish account, God created man in his own image, so it may be said that the Greeks created their gods in the image of man, not only in written but in visible form, and showed the value they set upon life. The art of the Periclean age, whether it presents gods or men, presents them in complete harmony of body and mind, without the slightest trace of nervousness about the goodness or the meaning of life. There is no sign of trouble or doubt, no sense of withdrawal into themselves or renouncements of the external world, to be seen on their faces. Nor, on the other hand, is there any suggestion of inertness or blindness to reality. The eyes of gods and men look forth openly and courageously upon their world. The Apollo at the Olympia, and the men and youths and maidens in the frieze of the Parthenon are intent upon the action of that particular moment without reservation or criticism. Nor can we detect in the serenity the mental effort of having to conquer fears or doubts born of disillusionment. The gods and men of the Parthenon are no less masters over life than the heroes or heroines in Sophocles' play. In order to for the solace to feeling of pity and fear to be aroused by the course of the world, the dramatists present in his tragedy men and women involved in, yet manifestly able to endure, crucially, and to triumph over, the circumstances of life. In sculpture, their artists produced figures whose great seriousness implied full consciousness of meaning of life, and raised them far above the easy sensual life of the Homeric Olympians. Those figures express the reality of the world, as conceived by a vigorous people building their own house of life, unhampered by ideals or ruins from the past. Their belief in the desirability of life triumphs over the misfortunes and weaknesses of the individual lives. Sorrow and joy, quote, come round all as the bear moves in his circling path. But the balance of life accepted under such conditions is no less delicate than the refinements of the art which springs from it. And when the force of adversity swept too long and strongly in one direction, i.e. in the Peloponnesian Wars, men found that reality was after all too strong for them, and that they could no longer face it with unaided courage. The peculiar nature of the Greek view of life can be best understood in the Parthenon. Parthenon is the perfect realization in artistic form of that belief in necessary limits of the practical world upon which life Pericles Athens rested. As the city-state of the funeral oration claimed to assure the possibilities of life more completely than any other form of state, so in the Parthenon the artist, working far more complete control over his material, has evolved a form able to satisfy completely the eye and mind of the spectator, of like nature with himself, by the clear articulation of coordination and perfect reasonableness of its structure, there in a form into which no element of the unknown or infinite intruded, whose limits were defined and imposed by himself, and the mind recognized in them something entirely good and fair, in which it could rest satisfied, freed from the accidents and incalculable forces by which actual life was disturbed. The Parthenon is supreme in beauty and divinity for those whose final reality lies within the limits of life, whose delights are with the sons of men. It is preeminently the house built with hands. There are no places in this house of God where sight is swallowed up in the mystery, and the eye follows soaring lines into dimness, or is overpowered by the space and light beneath great domes. The visitor to the Parthenon cannot fail to realize the limiting power and strong downward thrust, the negation of all soaring to the infinite, which the architect Metopes and Cornice of a Doric temple exercise. No one has expressed the sense of mystery in modern building, so different from the Greek attitude, better than Wordsworth, who speaks of the builder of the King's College Chapel in Cambridge as thus: the man who fashioned for the sense these lofty pillars, spread that branching roof self-poised and scooped into 10,000 cells where light and shade repose, while music dwells lingering and wandering on as loth to die, like thoughts whose very sweetness yieldeth proof that they were born for immortality. And Wordsworth's description of St. Paul's, the younger pile whose sky-like dome hath typified by reaching of daring art infinity's embrace. Close quote. So everywhere in Europe, except on the Acropolis, great buildings fall short of perfection. Cathedral is contrasted with cathedral. Inferiorities and superiorities are admitted. Here a west front, there the loftiness of nave or chancel is held up to be unsurpassed. But no competent critic has ever felt justified in censoring this or that detail in the Parthenon as a failty, or in maintaining that a wider front or a thicker or more slender column would have made it more perfect. Renan relates in his Souvenir that he came to Athens convinced that perfection does not belong to this world and averse to believe in the miraculous. On the Acropolis, he was overwhelmed by le miracle grec, l'impression que me fit Athènes est de beaucoup le plus fort que j'ai jamais ressenti. Il y a un lieu où la perfection existe. Il n'y en a pas de... C'est celui-là. C'était l'idéal cristallisé en marbre pentelique. But to the contemporary Greek, Parthenon was no miracle. The architects and masons of the workmen knew very well the relationship of each part, detail to the whole, how each stone had come into its proper place. They had complete control over the marble in which they worked, and what could not be realized entirely in the less plastic material of human nature, exposed the incalculable influences, was realized exactly in their art. The result corresponded with their intentions, because those intentions were completely reasonable and limited. The Parthenon seems a miracle, and that only in an equivocal sense, to those whose reality is no longer forms of finite existence, but a spiritual, infinite God, whose power and presence they are ever striving to express in visible and therefore limited form. So there arises that contradiction and inadequacy in expression which is nearly always felt in Europe and European art since the 5th century BC. It is only by comparison with subsequent works the perfection of the Parthenon is acknowledged, and with that acknowledgement came the certainty that one form of the world, as Hegel would say, had grown old. As the Parthenon is the perfection of limited form in architecture, so it marks the point where the finite ceases to satisfy the spirits of man. In the art of the following century, we notice the presence of new qualities, pathos and aloofness, of expression suggesting the insufficiency of life, the effort to impress by what is vast and elaborate. Man is beginning to retire into himself, to withdraw from the contact with the rough facts of here and now, and to find enchantment in what is distant in the outer world or unexplored within himself. How romantic, how disdainful of the finite is Plato's philosopher king, quote, the spectator of all time and of all being, close quote. The 4th century is still more the 3rd, are full of voices crying in the wilderness for the attempt to live according to the facts of experience that had failed, and man was searching for a new way of life. The romantic consciousness, with its unceasing quest of the infinite, had been born from the perfection and the ruins of the Periclean Athens. We might call the Athenian way of life in the 5th century BC the gospel of the finite. The Athenians followed out that gospel with a seriousness and energy of which the splendor of their manifold achievements is the measure. Its failure has proved that the finite is not enough for man to live by. Like Cleopatra, he has discovered immortal longings in his consciousness, and the full understanding of that gospel, and of all that is implied in its failure, is perhaps the more important than the appreciation of Greek literature and art to a world which, after the reaction from the endless dreariness of Roman materialism, has spent itself, now stands painfully distracted between the claims of the finite and the infinite. It is the third, and it is hard at times, in view of the political, social, and religious controversies of the present day, to believe that we are in earnest about either the infinite or the finite. Yet it is upon the resolution or synthesis in some higher form of those two elements in our consciousness that the real progress and happiness of the Western races depend.